So here we are reviewing High Life, classed as a sci-fi horror. Claire Denis, French filmmaker who I know quite well. I remember seeing her first film Chocolat when I was a mere 18 years of age at the Chelsea Cinema. She also has made White Material, Beau Travail. She's an art house filmmaker, and it stars Robert Pattinson, Juliette Binoche, and curiously Andre 3000, who is one half of the hip-hop band Outcast. This is a curious one. Now, the trailer for this was an intensely exciting, thought-provoking, stylish, intriguing, atmospheric, beautifully shot, beautifully edited trailer as well, that suggested we were in store for a really intriguing and quite cerebral and thoughtful exploration of what it means to be human and being in the outer regions of space heading towards a black hole. And that's not to say that all of those things weren't in this, but before we get into that, the film focuses on a ship that is heading towards the black hole, and on this ship are a bunch of criminals, one of whom is Robert Pattinson, the other one Andre 3000. They're being looked after by a scientist/nurse played by Juliette Binoche. Now, what's happening on this mission is that essentially these criminals, who when they go to bed in their sort of dormitories, if you like, are strapped, or their wrists are sort of bound to the beds that they're in, they're essentially being experimented on sexually by Juliette Binoche. You're never given any clarity as to what specifically is going on, why it's happening, what the purpose of the mission is, what the purpose of the research is, and neither should you be told that, because in the great tradition of films like Moon and even Alien, where you have this sense of a sort of multinational, multi-intergalactic corporate entity that's kind of, sent this mission off for commercial reasons. Even in Blade Runner, there's the Tyrell Corporation. There's an idea that there's an authority or an organization or something that seeks some kind of commercial information from whatever experiment's going on. And so consequently, you never get that sort of unpacked, but that's not really a problem. But what you are aware of is that essentially Juliette Binoche is exploring the sexual anatomy of the women, specifically, on board this ship. You've got a number of these various characters, one played by Mia Goth, or, as I said, one played by Andre 3000 from Outcast. Robert Pattinson was very good, but he was also very inexpressive and very dour, very emotionally closed off. We discover that Robert Pattinson's character is on board the ship for killing a friend of his over a dog. Now, the film started with a series of close-ups in this garden, which reminded me of some of the films of the 1970s. I can't remember, there's a particular film that had these three little sort of droids or robots, and they were all moving around in a garden which was in a sort of bubble in space. I can't remember what that film was, but it was great. Made me think a little bit of films like Dark Star, Logan's Run, things like that. So essentially they're all flying towards this black hole. Now, obviously they're criminals, and there are some really sort of beautiful shots in this, and I think this is a film of numerous brilliant ideas and brilliant concepts. And yet, I think the problem with it was that it never really knew whether it was sufficiently a science fiction film or sufficiently an art house movie. And whilst the combination of the two could theoretically work quite well, I think the thing about really classy sci-fi films is that if they're done well, and I'm thinking of films like Alien when it first came out, Blade Runner is a classic example, if they're done really well, the art housiness of them, if you like, or the sort of the intellectual avant-gardeness of them, it is just there in the film. It's naturally there because it's naturally in the world, it's naturally in the execution of the world. And one of my problems with this film was I just didn't feel that, although we haven't got a universe and we haven't got a world and we haven't got a civilization even back, well, this is the problem. We don't have a civilization that's referenced to in terms of like, where have these criminals come from? Who are they sort of being shipped away from? Who's asking them to do these experiments? But you do get one really achingly awful scene where you cut from space to a couple on a train where a scientist or a researcher or a professor or someone essentially just gives us the narrative line of why they're up in space and that they're up there. I mean, it felt like if you see the film, do tell me if I'm right, but it felt like a real stitched in moment. It felt so out of place amongst all this, what could have been just this really slowly ratcheting, scene building, atmospherically developing sort of sci-fi drama horror. So whilst I'd say it is a sci-fi horror, weirdly, I didn't have any real sense of menace. I didn't have any real sense of the unknown in the way that I did in a film like Ex Machina, even though you kind of knew she was AI in that, in the way that I did in a film like Life, you know, that one where they find that microbial life form, Jake Gyllenhaal, Ryan Reynolds, and it slowly takes over the ship. And I felt with this film, I felt it was a little bit heavy-handed in the science execution. I mean, let's not beat around the bush. Science fiction is involved with science, and I felt the science in this was just a bit of an add-on. The science was sexually orientated, and in this they had this curious device of this room called the box, which again I thought could have been handled in a much more sophisticated manner by the director. The box is essentially a room that all members of the ship go into to masturbate in. There's one very long and very sort of lingering scene of Juliette Binoche essentially having sex on a bucking dildo machine. And there's these really quite rank details, which, you know, okay, I'm not that squeamish. I've seen films like Mandy and think they're brilliant. But when you then you see sort of creamy liquid come out of the edge of a door as a suggestion that this has been extracted from the room, it was kind of just repulsive. You know, at one point Juliette Binoche rapes Robert Pattinson, and then she essentially with a turkey baster takes the semen out and puts it in another woman, and then in that way Robert Pattinson ends up flying through space with his daughter. So the film builds across time where we gradually lose various members of this criminal group. Weirdly, Andre 3000 walks into the garden, lies down and disappears. I didn't quite understand how he died. I mean, you could argue it was sort of art housey, you could argue it was a bit sort of, you know, avant-garde, but it just didn't really make any logical sense. So it eventually transpires across time that Dibbs, the scientist played by Juliette Binoche, tells Robert Pattinson that in fact this girl is his daughter, and we're left with just Robert Pattinson and this, by the end of the film, a teenage girl who Robert Pattinson hasn't got any older, and his daughter has gone from baby to teenager. Slightly creaky. They intercept here's another example of how it's quite a rich film that never really, I felt, delivered on its promise with many scenes. So they intercept this other stray sort of ship, and they dock. Robert Pattinson goes on board this ship, and they discover that there are just loads of stray dogs on this ship, basically eating each other and shitting everywhere. And I thought this was a really rich moment for some sort of exploration of, is it a contagious ship? What's going on in there? What's the history? And I really wanted to start to piece together things. In a weird way, this film didn't give you enough shards or broken bits of other things for you to try and fit in the pieces. Because I think that's one of the things about sci-fi. It's a bit like a puzzle. You're thinking, oh, right, does that fit with that? Does that mean that? Does this mean that? There weren't enough believable bits that you could even sort of play with slotting around. So whilst on many levels you'd look at a sort of any shot or any scene and you go, okay, well that looks quite compelling, it looks quite interesting, it was nicely shot. You know, the ship design was brilliant, and that's designed by the artist Olafur Eliasson, the Danish-Icelandic artist. You know, I liked all of that. I just didn't believe the science, I didn't believe the mission, and therefore, because I didn't believe those things, it didn't become the massively existential exploration of what it means to be human. I thought at its strongest there were a couple of scenes where one of the women on the ship, or one of the inmates, criminals, manages to get on a sort of pod and fly towards the black hole in either a bid to escape or a bid to just go somewhere else. And as she goes off, she enters the edge of the black hole, and something which apparently in scientific terms is called spaghettification happens, where her body is essentially ripped to shreds. So, you know, there were moments like that, and the abstraction and the abstract shots of the sort of edge of the black hole, especially given the photos we've seen recently taken of a black hole, I thought were very magical and quite sort of thought-provoking, and made me sort of think of the best moments of a film like 2001: A Space Odyssey. But there weren't enough of those moments. It was just a bit leaden around it. And so you had another moment like that towards the end where they headed off into this sort of yellow light. You can see how it kind of ticked enough of the boxes for all the critics to say, oh, this is a really thought-provoking, you know, sci-fi. This is where sci-fi meets art house. But I actually think it was a very weak story. And by being a weak story and having some weak sci-fi elements to it, it didn't encourage you into any deeper considerations of what it meant to be a human, not a human, in space, traveling through space, even the expendability and the recyclability of people. You know, that didn't really get explored massively. I just thought there was a bit of titillation, there was a bit of gratuitous sex. There was a very, very sort of morose, moody Robert Pattinson wandering around a couple of corridors. And yeah, it just did all the sum of its parts didn't really pull together for me into a sort of meaningful whole. The idea of creating a perfect human, or the idea of sexual experimentation on people, should be quite rich. And in that regard, ultimately, I thought it was tickling at the edges of some of the same subjects that Jonathan Glazer's film Under the Skin very successfully explored. It sort of abstractly connected with the meaning of life within a science fiction context, and it had a sort of strong reproductive sexual orientation to it without being gratuitous. It made you think about the human body, it made you think about us as organs, it made you think about alien life, it made you think about what it means to be a human, or just a salient being. Having seen Under the Skin, I felt there were moments where this was like Under the Skin light. It was trying to be the same thing. It was trying to marry that sort of narrative with total abstraction, and it just jarred, and it just didn't quite fit together quite well enough. So, you know, where there was promise, I feel a lot of this film was squandered on a very uneven narrative arc. Characters came and went very messily, and, you know, that kind of detail does matter. You want some kind of coherence if you're being asked to coherently understand why Juliette, you know, I didn't really understand Juliette Binoche, I didn't understand why she was doing it. It felt like the director was almost so in awe of Juliette Binoche, particularly when she was on the masturbating machine, the bucking bronco, quite literally, that you just thought she was sort of almost so sort of idolising her that she didn't really think about characterising her too much. Obviously, we know Robert Pattinson from Twilight. I feel like he's trying to reach out beyond that slight typecasting that he perhaps feels there. You know, interestingly, he was cast, but you know, the director Claire Denis was originally hoping for someone like Philip Seymour Hoffman to take on the part. So that's who she originally had in mind to play this character. And I sort of wondered when I read that after seeing it whether what is essentially a very static, very still, very non-verbal film would have been all the richer if an actor like Philip Seymour Hoffman had taken on the part. This was a sci-fi drama that was not sufficiently convincing in its sci-fi. It needed more convincing, I think, sci-fi bones in it. I mean, a film like Life is a good example. You know, I get where she was going with the abstraction. I liked the idea. I mean, I was really up for an art house French filmmaker approaching sci-fi in some sort of very adventurous and innovative way. I wouldn't say there was as much innovation in this as I think a lot of the reviewers are making out. So in that regard, I was a little bit disappointed. I think there were many, many very rich ideas in this, and I can see why all of the actors and performers and all the sum of its parts came together to make it. But I think in its execution, I think it became a little self-indulgent and a little over-reliant on not a lot to do the job. And I think the thing with sci-fi is you have to, I mean, even in things like Star Wars, you have to convincingly have real sort of rigor and depth to the science fiction that you're putting in front of the viewer. We need to believe that this technology, or even that this experiment, has real sort of depth and meaning and conviction, and that it serves a purpose of some form. And I felt this didn't. I felt there was a bit of, the conceit was too obviously there all the way through it.
For more film and family fun, don't forget to click the subscribe button and make sure to click the bell to never miss an update.